Hi, my name is Jason Morgan and I'm a professional wildlife artist. On this video I'm going to show you how I paint a very detailed tiger from start to finish. The original painting took me about 8 hours to paint, so you're going to see all the best bits in this video series. All I've done so far is drawn the canvas using a standard pencil, HB or something like that, and I've just sealed the pencil drawing using permanent pastel fixative. I've done this stage just because I didn't want to make the video another 2.5 hours long. So let's start painting. I'm going to tone the canvas just with some standard acrylic paint, just watered down with just normal tap water, just to make it nice and thin so it is transparent. And the colour I'm using is burnt sienna. And I'm just brushing it quite roughly over the canvas, just covering the whole area. Doing it quite quickly so it stays wet. And this whole stage just serves a purpose to get rid of the white canvas, really, to make the tones, the lights and dark tones that will follow much easier to actually see and to put down in the early stages. So I've just covered the canvas and it's still wet. I'm just brushing it all around, getting it right into the weave of the canvas, up and down and side to side. And then I've just taken some kitchen tissue and I'm just wiping off the excess, smoothing it out again. Just getting a nice even tone. And working quite quickly so it doesn't dry. Okay, that's dried now, and you could have dried that with a hairdryer if you wanted, or allowed it to just stand for about 15 minutes. Acrylic dries very fast. And now I'm going to put a second layer on using the same colour, burnt sienna. And I'm just going to put it in the darker areas, just to give a tonal underpainting, just to show me where the darkest darks and the lightest lights are going to be on the painting. I'm still using just a thick, wide household brush, just a cheap brush. There's no need for any details or anything at this stage. And on some of my other videos you will have seen me complete this tonal underpainting just by brushing over again and then just wiping the lighter areas away with some kitchen roll or tissue. Okay, that underpainting, the tonal area is dry, and now I'm going to start with the alkyd oils, just making up a nice dark to block in the darkest areas. And on the right you can now see the paints that I'm using. You'll notice that I've got 2 titanium whites on my palette. The only reason for that is that as I'm dipping in and out of a white paint I usually end up muddying it, so if I've got a separate white, which I try to reserve for cleaner areas, it saves me going back to tubes and putting more white out all the time. So here I've just made up a nice dark, just blocking in those stripes. There you can see the reference photo that I'm working from. So I'm blocking in the stripes just to get them in there at an early stage, and that's going to allow me to more easily follow the shape and form and areas of the tiger, and it also stops them from disappearing as I apply more layers of paint. So if I get them in now, and then I'm using an opaque paint for the sandy colour or browner areas of the fur, by getting these stripes in now at an early stage, it stops those pencil marks from being under the other layers and being very difficult to see. Alkyd oil paints, they behave just the same as normal oil paints. The only difference is they've got an alkyd in them so they dry overnight. And here I've just continued with that blocking in process of the stripes, and now I'm making up a dark or mid-tone fur colour. So I'm using some burnt sienna for the redness of the area. Cad orange. You'll see I dip into lots of different types of paints. And to the right of me, if you see my hand go out of shot, it's usually picking up just a little bit of paint in medium or paint thinners. The medium I use is a walnut alkyd medium by M. Graham, but you could use Liquin, and it's just the same really. It just allows the paint to be that little bit thinner rather than straight from the tube, or just thin it with a little bit of odourless paint thinners. Okay, I'm constantly referencing my photo. I'm looking back and forth to it as I'm searching out these darker areas. Very few of these initial paint marks will actually be visible in the final painting, but everybody's got to start somewhere so that you can estimate and guess and judge one area by another. So that's what I'm actually doing now. I'm gonna just work around the canvas looking for the lighter areas of the white, which are more of a grey, and I'm also looking for the dark brown areas of the fur, just to get a general feeling of the whole composition. And it's also quite important on these first layers of paint to paint darker than you want the final painting to be. If you don't paint dark enough at the early stages, when you want to put on the real bright highlights, they'll have nothing to sit on which is dark enough, so they will just kind of disappear. And that's also why I've got this nice orangey tone to the canvas as well. It makes these, especially the whiter areas or these grey areas, much easier to actually judge and see. The tone canvas is really acting as a mid-tone for the tiger. The brushes I'm using are by Rosemary & Co. You can see links to those on my website and Facebook, and they're just fantastic quality and a great price too. And the brush you'll see me use more often than not will be the long flat classic brush, which is a hog type brush, and I usually use a number 1 or number 2 for this sized painting. A flat brush allows me to put a fine thin stroke and also a wider stroke, all dependent on the angle that I apply the brush to the canvas. So I find it much more versatile than a round brush. Just lightening with a little bit more titanium white. You can imagine if I'd left that canvas untoned and I'd left it white, how much more work I would have had to have done to get to this stage. Okay, I've continued over most of the face now with the undertone for the white, and I'm just going to start bringing up that dark to mid-tone fur colour now. It's a bit easier to block in and to actually assess now I've got some of those whiter areas in. So I'm just going around the eye, around the tear area of the eye. And it's important not to be afraid to just get some colour down at this stage. My way of painting is really a case of putting a colour down, assessing it and then adjusting it, and I'll be adjusting all the way through this painting, making more accurate choices when I can assess it from the paint I've already put down. So don't be too critical of the colour and the tone at this stage. You've just got to get something down to make a start. You can see there how those dark marks are still staying put. I can still see them quite easily even though I'm painting directly over them. So that's going to make painting those much easier at later stages. If I hadn't darkened those in straight away, they would have, the pencil marks would have just disappeared under this layer of paint. Just using a scrubbing motion just to get the paint down on the canvas. But mostly I will be painting in the direction of the fur growth, just so that any texture and any lines will actually still look realistic because it is in the correct direction. Still carrying on with this darker tone. Alkyd oils generally take about 12 hours to dry to a stage where you can overpaint them, so I get plenty of time to play around with different layers in one sitting. I've just lightened the paint up a little bit more. Just starting to block in those lighter areas now. Just scrubbing the paint in. Checking my reference. And of course I'm just showing you the actual techniques on this video. Hopefully you can then apply them to your painting and the subjects you want to paint. And you don't always have to get a very high degree of detail either. You may find after I've painted for 1 or 2 hours on this demonstration that it's reached a stage that's more painterly, but perhaps it's a stage where you would rather finish your paintings. Here I've just carried on with that mid-tone colour, just blocking in as I've done already. Just working my way around the canvas quite quickly. Thinning the paint a little bit with medium just to allow it to apply more easily. And then looking across at my reference. It's no good just painting haphazardly. I've got a printout of the reference photo from Steve Tracy on the right hand side of the canvas, and on the far left out of view you'll see me glancing across every now and again, and I've actually got the picture on a computer monitor screen, and I'm finding much more that especially for subjects that are very brightly lit or they've got a very highlighted side offset against a shadow side, that the computer monitor actually shows or represents it much better than a printout. Because you've got to remember that a printout, the whitest white can only be the white of the paper, whereas on a screen you've got a light shining behind that's really giving you a much more of a feel of how the subject was in real life. So if you see me glancing to the left, that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the screen. Okay, I've carried on with that lighter tone blocking in. Things are starting to look a little bit more solid and coming together a bit more now, the shape and the form. I'm just going to start blocking in some more of these whiter fur areas. So I'm using some, back into the same mix, some ultramarine blue, some lamp black, white. So it's a very opaque mix, and it's much darker than it will be at the final stage. Add in some black just to make it darker. A little bit more medium. Okay, I've zoomed in now and we can concentrate on the eyes. Starting with a rich reddy brown colour right on the outside and also near the pupil. Around the pupil is normally quite a soft edge, and lots of beginner artists paint a very hard edged black pupil which can look really artificial. I've switched to a round brush now just to make it a little bit easier to apply the paint in this smaller area. Just lightened it with some Naples yellow and also some cad yellow. But obviously the colours that I'm using are just specific to the reference and to the subject I'm painting. When you're painting your own subject, obviously you'd use your own colours. Lots of people ask me for specific recipes. What colour do I use to paint a tiger, or what colour do I use to paint a lion? And I can never give those recipes because the colour always changes with the subject and the light. So even if I gave 100 different step-by-steps, almost like paint by numbers to paint something, you're never going to learn from that technique, because when you want to paint something perhaps you've taken a photo of, or something different, you're going to be stuck. So it's much better to actually learn how to see colour and to mix colour. And I go into that in quite a lot of detail on my ebooks, especially oil painting made easy. Okay, so I'm putting kind of a grey green, nice opaque colour into the eye. And the one side of the face is in more shadow than the other, so the eyes will be a little bit different than each other. Using a light touch to blend. Adjusting the shape of the eye as I'm going, and I know that I'm going to come back in with some real dark blacks just to outline the eye as well, so I'll cut back into those colours again. Some black, some burnt umber, burnt sienna, just making a nice dark. I've gone to an even smaller brush now just to get a bit more control. A little bit of cad orange, burnt sienna. Just creating that shadow area over the top of the eye. Just put some straight burnt sienna in now. You'll notice I actually clean the brush out very, very rarely. I'd much rather work with a dirty brush. so that all the colours are blending on the brush as well. A little bit more medium into a black, just to re-establish these real darks. I'm looking at the reference almost as much as I'm looking at the canvas. Pure black going in now. A little bit more medium just to keep the paint nice and thin. And you can see how I'm cutting into those colours that I put down, reaffirming the shape. And the pupil as well, which is not round, it's more of a diamond shape. Going back to the slightly larger brush, use a little bit more of the cad orange and the burnt sienna. A bit more burnt sienna, a bit more cad. That's creating that highlighted bottom part. Allowing the colours to blend, so that I haven't got to mix hundreds of different colours. They can all blend together and it's much more natural. Added some Naples yellow just to get that highlight at the bottom. And the eye is quite detailed. It's almost like a yellow vein in the eye. It's where the light is bouncing around inside. The eye always looks very dead and muted until the actual highlight goes on. Now I'm just going to continue the exact same process on the opposite eye. Just re-establishing the darks. Just with pure lamp black. Lamp black is nothing special. Any other black would do just as well, really. It's just one that I've used for years, and so I generally just stick with it. Just darkening that mix down with some burnt sienna and reshaping the eye. Sometimes I'll see a colour that I want to mix and I'll notice that it's like the combination of two colours already on the palette, so I just blend them together. That makes things much easier than making a new mix every time. Just going to put in a few of the fine haze over the eye, just so that I can assess it a bit more and see where I'm actually going here. And it gives the shape a little bit more form. Same on the other side, and then I'll just put a little bit of the highlight across, and you'll see how instantly the eye starts to come alive. You compare the left one to the right. Just a light touch on top of the wet paint, and that's what gives it life. And you can see there why the bottom of the eye is lit up, because that light from the highlight is shining down into the bottom section of the eye. I'm just going to put a few lights around now, just so that I can assess the actual tones that I'm painting. So it helps to put a few highlights in. So I'm just lightening that mix just with titanium white, and that's just going to show me an example of how light these areas need to be. And then I can judge and assess all the other areas against it. So just a few marks here and there. And these will all be painted over in different layers. So they're there just to aid me. more white, and I'm just using the chiseled edge. I'm actually loading the brush on one side and then I'm switching it over and loading it on the other side, and that's making this round brush have a flat chiseled edge, so it's giving me a much finer line. And I'm also using the paint really quite thickly, so it's very opaque. I'd normally be sitting to the left of the screen now, so there's more of a natural position, but I want to try and stay out of the shot as much as possible so you can see the brush strokes. So I'm at a different angle than I would normally be painting. Once again, I'm just putting in a representation of these highlights. Creating that chiseled edge to the round brush. Load in frequently. It's a fine balance between having the paint thick enough so it's nice and opaque, but it's still got to have some medium or a little bit of paint thinners even. It's paint thinners I'm using more often than not now, just to make it slightly thinner so that it applies and sticks to the canvas more easily. If I make a mistake, I just dab it off with my thumb or finger. Just increasing the brightness of the highlight. Okay, I've zoomed back out now so I can work on the tiger as a whole. And I've got a nice wide brush, wide flat brush. If I'm working on a large area, I obviously select a large brush. And I'm adding some red and blue in there, just to give it a lavender look, a nice coolness to it. You've always got to constantly kind of work against your mind. You see an area that you know it's white fur, but generally it's every colour other than white. So you've really got to concentrate on what the colour is really there that you're actually seeing, not what you're thinking you're seeing there. Sometimes I use the eyedropper tool or something like that on the computer, a colour selector, or even a white piece of paper just to put next to the reference photo, just to give me a better example of the colour that I should be painting. As you get more and more used to painting, then you start to see the real colours more easily, rather than the colour you expect to be there or you think is there. You can see I can cover quite a large area quickly with this larger brush. Lots of beginners, they generally stick with a small brush and they start putting the details in way too early. And then the painting can take forever just to do the underpainting. Still brushing in the direction of the fur growth. Scrubbing it in, just laying that colour down. Everything is still wet other than the underpainting. So basically just the black stripes, and that's why they're not moving around as I'm painting into them. And even with this opaque, very opaque paint I'm applying, you can still see the stripes through it and underneath. I've changed brushes now. It's still wide, it's still flat. It's another classic hog brush, but it's got a much better chiseled edge, so I can start adding some details over the top of this underpainting. Painting in that fur direction. Sometimes because the underpainting is still so wet, when you're actually painting over the top, it's blending underneath, so you've got to use an even lighter colour than you would normally expect. Because the underpainting is still wet, it's giving me a nice soft diffuse appearance to the fur rather than real sharp hard edges, which is great for an underpainting, and it'll make those sharp marks, those detailed marks that I put on in the end, really stand out well. Okay, I've just blocked in all that white lavender kind of area, and I'm going to start working on other areas around the canvas, just to try and bring it all up to around about the same level of completion. What I'm really after is a real nice solid looking base to the cat. Something nice and opaque so that I can build those layers up easily on top with really much more accurate colours and tones. A little bit of Windsor red to warm the colour up. Cad yellow deep then to give it a slight orange look. I've got a smaller brush, a smaller area to paint, so I'm blocking in that nose. Just getting the general colour in first. subduing and darkening the colour a little bit with burnt sienna. Just putting on the shadowy areas. See how I've even mixed some of that grey, the grey tone that I used earlier on in with it. I found lots of times that a colour is actually a mixture of other colours that you see around the canvas. So don't be afraid to actually use a colour you've already got there. Especially for subduing, and that gives much more unity with the painting. There's usually quite a lot of different things going on with the nose of a big cat. You get lots of different variations in colour and lots of differences with highlights and shadows. So I'm just darkening in the under area of the nose, just reforming the shape that I've painted over a little bit. Just correcting areas that I've gone out. Really darkening that bottom section, also the slight indication of the indentation coming up. Okay, I've got a much finer brush now. I want to put in the area of shadow at the top of the nose. Okay, that's enough for the nose for now. That's the underpainting of it done. So I'm just darkening in some areas now with Alkids. Most of the darks at the moment are from the initial acrylic. So I'm just looking across at the reference. You can see that at the moment mine is much orange or reddy colour. But that's just creating that underpainting so that I can layer on top, and I haven't got to follow the reference image religiously anyway, so I'm just searching out the darks and putting those in. Okay, back to the big brush now. Some Cad Yellow Deep, Lamp Black, and I'll make a kind of a green, Naples Yellow to lighten it. Burnt Umber is a great colour to actually subdue as well. I've also got plenty of thinners on the brush. We can scrub this background in. Make up plenty of paint. And this will be the base mix, and then I'll adjust this mix then as I need to. So it's a big area, so I'm using a big brush and just scrubbing that colour in. It's nice and opaque. Now I could have put the background in first if I'd wanted and then overlaid the tiger, but what I find is if I actually paint the tiger in first, the underpainting, it then allows me to assess what lightness and darkness I really want that background to be. Whether I want it to be dark to offset the lighter areas of the cat, or to be light to offset darker areas. And I'm dragging that colour over the edge of the tiger. I'm not buttoning it right up against the edge. I don't want a cut-out appearance, like the tiger's been cut out of a magazine and then stuck on there. So I'm actually going in, and then when I'm putting on further layers of paint, I'll then overlap onto the background. So I've carried that colour all the way around, it's all still wet, and now I'm making up a nice vibrant green, and I'll put that into the wet paint, and that will adjust the colour a little bit as well, just to create an idea of leaves and twigs and sticks and just general vegetation in the background in the distance. I don't want it to be too detailed in this portrait. The actual scenery behind is not really of much consequence, so I want it quite subdued. Just suggestions here and there, just nice loose brush strokes. Quite thick paint because the underpainting is wet. That base green tone. Just generally mixing various colours that I'm thinking of using, not even on the reference image. So I'm just making up various mixes and seeing how they work. Obviously the angle of the side of the canvas is straight in real life. It's not bent out to the side, that's just the angle of the camera, so that I'm not in the actual position that you're viewing all the time, so I've got to offset the camera slightly. And I'm just using a dirty brush all the time. I'm not cleaning my brush in between mixes, I'm allowing them to influence the other colours. Thick paint there just to give a more defined edge. That's just a very subdued, subtle background. And now I've got a very fine, soft, synthetic brush, and I'm just lightly going over the top, just to blur it slightly. Now any soft synthetic brush will do, and this one's around about 1 inch wide. I'm using a real light touch just to subdue and diffuse the edges. Just making it all look as if it's much more distant. Okay, I've cleaned that area of the palette off now, just because I need a fresh area to mix a completely different colour paint. What I'm starting to do now is just to start to refine the painting a little bit with this second layer. The first layer is dried, so I'm just going over it with a new layer of paint, and it's going to be a little bit more subtle now. I'm actually trying to get a more accurate colour, more accurate tones, even though this is still really a kind of a stage of underpainting because it's not detailing yet, of course. I'm just glancing across at the reference and I'm just looking for those more subtle changes in tone. Which area now should be lighter or which area should be darker. Comparing one area against another. And it's quite a transparent, although I'm using opaque paints, I'm using them very thinly. I'm just scrubbing so you can still see that the underlayers and other areas showing through. What I'm really doing here is making sure that the underpainting is going to be dark enough to actually allow the highlight or the lighter area that's going to come next to show up. So I've assessed that some of these areas are really not dark enough yet, so I'm just darkening them down. And I'm taking my time with making the colour as well. It's no good rushing too much and getting it completely wrong. Then I'm testing it on the canvas, judging it against another area, asking myself if it's too light or too dark, and adjusting the mix. You notice as well that the palette I'm using on the left of the screen has been toned almost to exactly the same colour that I did the first burnt sienna acrylic, where I toned the canvas, and that's deliberately done so it allows me to much more accurately and easily judge colours, because I'm using the same colour canvas and the same colour palette. Now the palette is then got a glass layer overlaid on it, and that's what I'm actually mixing on, so it's much easier to clean. And also on my YouTube channel you will see I've got a video showing how I actually make these palettes. It's very simple, and they last years and years. Of course you can use any palette you want. Okay, just lighten the colour a little bit more with some white and Naples yellow. I've created that edge on the brush again, on that flat brush, so I'm going to overlay and start using some lighter strokes. And if you use a light touch, all of this stage can be painted wet in wet. There's no need to let anything dry. All the paint will actually overlay at this stage, no problem at all. But if you'd rather allow your painting to dry, it's just as easy like that as well. So that's what I like about oils and alkyd oils. I haven't got to finish a specific section. I can just move around, and if I'm feeling tired for that day and I'm going to leave it, then I can just stop there, wash out my brushes, and then resume the next day. Okay, I'm just starting to add some texture to the bridge of the nose, but you can see that I'm still using that large brush, creating a chiseled edge and just using a fine touch. I don't want to start painting individual hairs at this stage. I find that if the better or the longer I leave it to paint the individual hairs, the more realistic it looks. If I paint them too early, it starts to look too artificial. So I try to use these large brushes as much as I can, and it also makes the painting much quicker as well. I'm concentrating on the direction of the fur, because on this bridge in between the eyes, the direction normally comes in and meets in the middle, and then it changes direction and actually starts going down the nose. So to make it realistic, you really need to study the reference. You saw that I just removed an area that I put on that the paint came off a little bit too thick, so I just dapped it off with my finger. You could use a tissue just as easily. Okay, that's that section completed, so I've just lightened it again with some more white. I've started painting on the higher highlighted side of the face, still with the large brush. So you can see now why I needed that dark underpainting. Well, none of these areas would be showing up at all. Still very rough. I still very much class this as the underpainting. And it's taken me probably about 2 hours to get to this stage. Now I've created one of those grey white mixes, so a bit of ultramarine blue, black, white, and I'm just increasing the highlight area, increasing the white area now. So I'm doing exactly the same as I did with the brown fur. I'm gradually getting lighter and lighter all the time, overlaying. I'm pretty much using thicker paint all the time too. If I want a thick stroke, I use that brush at a slight angle. If I want it very fine, then I'll get that chiseled edge and use just the edge of it. So you don't really need many brushes to complete a painting at all. But what I do like is to have 2 or 3 of the same type of brush, so I can have a dark, a mid-tone and a light of one area going at the same time if I wanted to, rather than wash the brush out all the time. I thought that was a bit too light, so I've just subdued it by smudging it a little bit with my finger, removing some of the paint. And some areas are more tricky to see what's actually going on the reference than others, and that's when I'm taking much more care painting, and I'm studying the image on the screen more, and I'm really taking my time to try and get the actual anatomy right. This area of the muzzle looks much wider than the opposite side of the face, but I'm going to have to adjust that opposite side as well. Okay, so I'm using the same brush, same type of mix, just carrying on around the canvas. If I want the fur to have a long bit of fur coming out, then obviously I use a longer stroke. You can see now how I'm overlapping the background. And using the paint that's actually on the palette already. I don't need to create a different mix all the time. And if I see a colour that I've put down actually appear somewhere else on the painting, I just pop that in there as well. I don't restrict myself to one area at a time when I'm painting. And then just subduing that edge, bringing it across a little bit so that I can overlay. Just bring that white over then to make a softer edge.